It's January 1077, and the most powerful man in Europe is standing barefoot in the snow. Henry IV, King of the Germans, heir to the crown of the Holy Roman Empire, is waiting outside a castle gate at Canossa, freezing, begging, not for land, not for an army. He's begging a pope to undo a single line of church law that had just knocked him off his own throne. When most folks picture the medieval church, they think prayer, faith, souls, sin, salvation, the spiritual stuff, a place you show up on Sunday, not a government you answer to on a Monday. Here's the thing, though. The church wasn't just praying over Europe, it was running it. It had its own courts, its own judges, its own written law, and it could tax you, try you, lock you up, and cut you off from God himself, all without asking a king for permission. And that whole legal machine, it didn't start as a machine at all. It started as a chaotic pile of contradictory letters, rulings, and half-remembered decisions scattered across 1,000 years. A mess, so tangled nobody could actually use it. So how does a heap of contradictions turn into a weapon that can freeze an emperor solid in the snow? And the guy who supposedly untangled the whole thing pulled off one of the biggest brain feats of the entire Middle Ages. We barely even know his name. This is the story of Canon Law, how a Greek word for a measuring stick grew into a legal empire that ruled like a state, stared down kings, got publicly torched, and still governs over 1 billion people today. Start with the word itself. Canon comes from the Greek canon, literally a straight rod, a measuring stick, a standard. And in the early Christian centuries, that's basically what church rules were, a rough standard for how to live and worship, patched together from Scripture, from habits handed down by the apostles, and from decisions bishops made when they gathered for big meetings called councils. When roughly 300 bishops met at Nicaea in the year 325, they didn't just hash out theology, they issued rules, and those rules stuck around for centuries. The trouble was, nobody kept it all in one place. For hundreds of years, the church's law lived in a sprawl of local collections, a council decision over here, a letter from a pope over there. Those papal letters had real teeth, by the way. A ruling a pope wrote down in a letter could carry the weight of law, and people saved and copied them like legal precedent. Around the year 500, a monk in Rome named Dionysius Exiguus, Dennis the Small, if you translate it straight, gathered a bunch of these councils and papal letters into one organized set. Fun side note. This is the same guy who came up with counting years as AD, which is why he pops up in way more history books than he probably ever bargained for. But even organized, the law just kept piling up, and the pieces didn't agree with each other. One ruling said one thing, another flat out said the opposite, and there was no clean way to tell which one won. By the early Middle Age, Canon Law was a contradiction stacked on top of a contradiction, technically enormous, practically a nightmare to actually use. Then, around 1140, in the Italian city of Bologna, somebody finally sat down and untangled it. His name was Gratian, and honestly, that's just about the most confident thing anyone can tell you about him. Historians still argue over who he actually was. A monk, a law teacher, possibly more than one person working in stages over time. What survives isn't really the man. It's the work, a giant book with a title that says it all. The Concordance of Discordant Canons. Everybody just calls it the Decretum. What Gratian pulled off was radical for the time. Instead of dumping all those contradictions on the reader and wishing them luck, he lined them up on purpose, this rule versus that rule, head to head, and then reasoned through them, step by step, to show how they could actually fit together. He treated church law like something you could analyze, like a science with a method. And that one move basically turned canon law from a messy filing cabinet into a real discipline you could study, teach, and argue in a courtroom. Bologna became the place to go learn it, and trained canon lawyers started rolling out the door like graduates off an assembly line. Once the church had a genuine legal system, it started using it like one. Over the next century and a half, popes began issuing official collections of their own rulings. The big one dropped in 1234 under Pope Gregory IX, followed by another under Boniface VIII in 1298, and more after that. Stacked all together, these became known as the corpus of canon law, and it was the operating manual for a seriously enormous power, because check out what those church courts actually controlled. Marriage, who was legally hitched and who wasn't. Wills and inheritance. Oaths and broken promises. Whether a kid counted as legitimate. Accusations of heresy. And the discipline of every single priest, monk, and bishop on the continent. If you were a clergyman accused of a crime, a lot of the time you didn't answer to the king's court at all. You answered to the churches, under a privilege called benefit of clergy. Two whole legal worlds running side by side, and the churches reached into just about everything. And its ultimate weapons weren't swords, they were sentences. Excommunication could cut a single person off from the church entirely. An interdict was even bigger. It could shut down religious life across an entire kingdom, freezing baptisms, weddings, and funerals for everybody at once. Pope Innocent III actually dropped that hammer on all of England around 1208 during a standoff with King John, and eventually forced the king to fold. These weren't idle threats. Which brings us right back to that freezing king in the snow. Henry IV had picked a fight with Pope Gregory VII over who got to appoint bishops, a long-running brawl known as the investiture controversy. Gregory's answer was to excommunicate him, and that didn't just sting spiritually. It legally released Henry's own nobles from their loyalty to him. All of a sudden, his crown was falling apart in his hands, so in the winter of 1077, he hauled himself across the Alps to Canossa to grovel. The story goes that he waited 3 days out in the snow before the Pope finally let him back in. And while some of that drama probably got polished up in the retelling, the core of it is solid. A single ruling of church law had brought an emperor to his knees. England got its own version a century later. When Henry II tried to haul criminal priests into royal courts, he slammed straight into his own archbishop, Thomas Becket, over that exact question, church law versus the king's law, whose court wins. It ended in 1170 with Becket cut down inside Canterbury Cathedral by 4 of the king's knights. The murder horrified Europe. And for a good while afterward, the church's legal turf held firm. For centuries, this parallel empire of law just kept growing. And then, in December of 1520, a German monk named Martin Luther walked out to a bonfire outside Wittenberg and threw the books of Canon Law straight into the flames, right alongside the Pope's letter condemning him. That wasn't just a protest, it was a flat-out declaration that the entire legal authority of Rome no longer had any hold on him. The Reformation ripped Europe's religious unity to shreds, and the church's claim to run everybody's courts went right along with it. In England, Henry VIII made the break official in the 1530s, cutting off all appeals to Rome and planting himself at the head of the church in his own kingdom. As nation-states got stronger, they clawed the law back for themselves. Marriage, wills, crime, one by one, these slid out of church hands and into the states. The church didn't disappear, but its days as the courtroom of all Europe were done. So it did something practical. It turned the law inward. In 1917, after centuries of lugging around that sprawling, tangled corpus, the church finally boiled canon law down into a single modern code, clean, numbered, organized like the law codes of modern nations, largely under a sharp legal mind named Pietro Gasparri. It got a full rewrite in 1983 under Pope John Paul II, updated for the modern church, and that version is still the working law for the world's roughly 1.3 billion Catholics today. And it still carries real weight. Canon law decides how the sacraments work, whether a marriage can be annulled, and how clergy get disciplined, including, most controversially, how the church handles accusations of abuse by its own priests. That's been a painful, unresolved fault line for years. Critics have argued the church's internal legal system was too slow, too secretive, and way too protective of its own. In response, recent popes have moved to tighten it up, peeling back layers of secrecy around abuse cases and overhauling the code's penal section in 2021. Whether any of that has gone far enough is still very much being fought over right now. But trace the whole thing all the way back, and you land in the exact same spot. A barefoot king in the snow at Canossa, waiting on a pope to lift one sentence of church law. That law started life as a Greek word for a measuring rod. and it grew into something that could measure a king and find him coming up short. It lost its grip on Europe's thrones eventually. It got burned, defied, and stripped away piece by piece, but it never actually died. It just quit ruling nations and turned to ruling a church of over 1 billion souls instead. The empire of law that once froze an emperor in place is a whole lot quieter now. It's also still open for business. If you're into origin stories like this one, hit subscribe and stick around for the next episode of Ancient Edict, and drop a comment telling us which everyday thing, law, or empire you want us to dig into next.